what's this combination? What's this relationship between silence and compassion? Because some people might not see those two as being related whatsoever.
Good question. The connection I think of is from St. John of the Cross, who's a Christian mystic of the 16th century, who said that God's first language is silence and God is love. So he connected the two very clearly with love, which of course compassion is an expression of love. And so God's presence is love, but God's language is silence. And I thought that's an interesting way of putting it, that we can experience, how do we experience God's presence? It's when there's compassion, when there's love, there's God. And yet, how do we communicate with God? And well, we communicate with God and we experience that presence through silence.
How do you practice silence? Is it just by being silent?
I know you have to say a lot, don't you, to be able to speak about silence and to understand silence.
Yeah.
But basically, the way I understand silence, it means to be present in a non-conceptual way. And I think that it helps when you frame it that way to say, well, most of the time when we go through life viewing it through our concepts. And think about how many concepts, how many thoughts we've had just today.
Yeah.
So we go through life filled with thoughts, ideas, opinions. Well, the whole practice of the spiritual life is to turn down the volume of that inner chatter. And so the more we turn down the volume of the inner chatter, the inner commentary, then we are moving toward silence, from concepts, images, thoughts, towards silence. So that's what it is. It's about dialing down the inner volume in order to be present to life in a non-conceptual way. And what that does, it gives us the direct experience of life, so that I come to experience you not through your words, but through the mere presence, which is silence.
So that non-conceptual thing that we're talking about is the inroad into compassion, to a greater being, or what would you call it?
Both compassion and to something that transcends your thinking and your physical structure. About compassion, if we turn down the volume inside of all the chatter, what are we turning down? The volume of the ego. And if we turn down the volume of the ego, then what arises is compassion. And because we get out of the way and we become more connected, we become more loving people, because I'm not concerned with myself, but about other people. And so the inner stories we tell ourselves, the inner chatter, the inner commentating, is all the conversation of the ego. So it's turning down the volume of the ego, and then what arises is a sense of connectedness, a sense of love, which is expressed in compassion. But also, as we turn down the volume of the ego, we can experience something inside of ourselves that transcends the ego, and that is the presence of God, or an ultimate reality. So that's what the mystics teach us, that the contemplative life is both a life that leads toward greater connection to others, compassion, and also a deeper connection to a reality inside of ourselves. Christians call it the kingdom of God within, the transcendent one.
I'm trying to also grasp this idea that when you clear away that clutter, that what you find is compassion. Instead of, some people might just think, well, you just find silence, you just find a certain quiet aspect of life. But you're convinced in your training that it really is, there is that inherent sense of compassion in that silence. Right.
That silence doesn't lead to nothingness.
Yeah.
It leads to emptiness. And there's a big difference between the
Right.
two. So it's, when you go inside and you turn down the volume of the ego, there's not nothing there, but there is empty. And what's it empty of? It's empty of ourself, empty of our ego. And yet there's still a presence there. And the presence, Christians say it real clearly. I mean, the teaching is that God is love. So if you experience God, you experience love. Now, that's what the teaching says. What about the experience? And my own personal experience as being a meditator, as being somebody who's been interested in the contemplative life for a long time, is that the more I get myself out of the way, the more I die to myself, my ego, the more I experience a deeper connectedness to reality, to other people, and therefore I sense that to be love.
You're using words like meditate, though, for example, and a lot of people, I think, they think that that's not part of Christianity.
Right.
That's part of Buddhism, that's part of a Hindu tradition. So explain to me how this contemplative, meditative tradition you're talking about exists in a Christian setting.
You're absolutely right. Many people are confused about this because the word meditation right now is being fired up and being promoted and being experienced and expressed by many of the Eastern traditions, especially Buddhism. But it has a rich tradition within Christianity itself. What is prayer? I mean, that's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
We're talking about communication with God is the issue here. And so traditionally in Christianity, there are three ways to communicate with God, three ways to pray. And one is there's verbal prayer. A second is there's mental prayer. And a third is contemplative prayer. So verbal prayers are what people are most familiar with. When I learned to talk to God, I learned the Our Father, or I learned to ask God for petitions, requests, to pray for my little dog that was sick. These are all things we learn as children. That's the first way to communicate with God, is verbally. But there's always been another way, and that is a mental prayer. And mental prayer is more sophisticated. It's not so much speaking to God, but it's reflecting on God, or reflecting on eternal truths. So that would be doing something like taking a scripture passage like, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. God leads me beside green pastures, and so forth. And taking that and then musing on it, pondering it. What's it trying to say to me? And so it's reflection, and it's called mental prayer. But there's a third kind that many people are not familiar with, and that's called contemplative prayer. And contemplative prayer goes all the way back to the Desert Fathers and Mothers of the 2nd and 3rd century in Christianity. Now, it has its roots going all the way back to the Scriptures, but we can see it most clearly expressed in the teachings of these Desert Fathers and Mothers, people who withdrew from the busy city in order to begin a contemplative life going inside. And they're the ones who said silence is the key to this whole thing. Calming the discursive mind, calming the ego in order to listen to God. And so this is what contemplative prayer is all about. And it has a long tradition beginning clearly with the writings of the Desert Fathers and Mothers in the 2nd century, but going all the way up to our time, our current time. Of course, the famous person here in Kentucky is Thomas Merton. Of course, I mean, he's deceased now, but he was he helped to revive this perhaps like no one else did. He made more and more people aware of the contemplative tradition within Christianity.
So let me ask you, why is it that this contemplative tradition that you're talking about isn't more in the mainstream? Because we've seen Buddhism flourish, a sense, in the United States. People are very attracted to that. So why has that aspect of Christianity not been pushed more into the public sphere?
Mm-hmm. Good question. For many years, it was hidden behind the cloistered monastery walls. And so the tradition has been very rich, but it's been in the monasteries and the convents. And when I joined our community and I began to take a serious look at my inner life and began the contemplative journey, I was taught the mystics, Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, Julian of Norwich, and so forth. So I learned them, and I'm very surprised that many people don't know them. But it was behind the monastery walls where it was taught. And I think one of the exciting things that's happening now is that the movement of the Eastern traditions into our culture has awoken many Christians to this contemplative tradition that's always been there. So it kind of catalyzed an awakening. And Thomas Merton himself had that experience of his connection with the Eastern traditions, woke up within him some new insights, some new ways of understanding the contemplative tradition that was already so richly a part of his life.
As you began your spiritual path, and it seems that you have this inherent interest in meditation.
I do.
Why then did you decide to go down a Christian path versus studying Buddhism or a different Eastern tradition?
Well, when I began, first of all, I was born a Christian. And so I was raised in the Christian milieu with the Christian symbols, the Christian scriptures, and those are such a rich part of my life. But when I was, in 1985, I was introduced to the Eastern traditions through a woman who's become a major teacher in my life. Her name is Sister Ishapriya. And Sister Ishapriya is a Catholic nun from England who lived in India. And I made a retreat with Ishapriya, and she was the one who introduced me to the wisdom of Advaita Vedanta and of Buddhism, of the Eastern traditions. And what it did, Jonathan, it awoke within me such a more deeper understanding of my Christian faith by studying the Eastern traditions. And it was through that experience, the study of those other traditions and the teachings made me a better Christian and helped me understand the mystics as well. So the way I have experienced it is, it's like to communicate with God, you need a language. Okay, silence is that language, but Christianity is the milieu. Christianity is the container that holds it. So it's like learning a language. And so English is my first language. My parents didn't grow up saying, Joe, well, when you grow up, you can speak whatever language you want. They taught me English. So it's going to be my first language always. I'm always going to think in English. I've tried to learn Spanish somewhat, but I still think in English. I dream in English. But I try to be multilingual. I try to be bilingual, And the same thing with the spiritual traditions. Christianity is always going to be my first language because it's the one I'm raised in. But I try to be bilingual or trilingual by learning the language of Buddhism and the language of Advaita Vedanta and other traditions so that I can begin to converse in those mystical languages as well.
How important are those symbols in the Western tradition? How important is that language in the culture of growing up in that Christian landscape?
Well, for me, they've been enormously important. I guess I can only speak from being inside of myself, that they gave me a symbol system. And I think that's what's crucial about this. Some people, I guess, are able to navigate it without the symbol system. But for me, the symbol system was important. So I grew up with rich Christian symbols, the Judeo-Christian symbols of the Exodus story, of the gospel stories, of the death and resurrection stories. So all of those are rich. We can look at them on many levels, but one way is to understand them. They are symbols that deeply touch who we are. Carl Jung, at the end of his life, began to write a lot about Christianity. And he began to write a treatise on the Trinity and on the Catholic Mass. And he himself was not he grew up Christian, but he was not a practicing Christian most of his life. But he was very active in writing about Christianity. And one commentator who I read made an interesting remark. It's like, Mr. Young, or Dr. Young, why are you doing this? I mean, you could retire. Why this sudden interest in Christianity? And this student of Jung's said that Jung was very concerned about Christianity because it was the symbol system of the Western psyche. And he didn't think it was serving the West as well as it could. In other words, he was trying to revive the symbols so they spoke to people. So they could really wake up people on a deeper level, on a trans-rational level. And so he was very concerned about this, that we would revive those symbols because people need those.
Whereas you might have seen those symbols and felt a certain affinity towards them or a certain connection, a lot of people might see them as, with a totally different interpretation, might feel trapped by them, might have different connotations associated with them that might turn them off from going deeper into a Christian faith. So isn't there something liberating about leaving that behind and maybe trying a different path?
On the surface, other religions do look different. For example, for me, looking at Hindu religion looks very different. For me, looking at Tibetan Buddhism looks very different as well from the outside. So I think many of us have that experience. When we look at another religion from outside, it can seem very strange and sometimes very bizarre. I've been to India numerous times, and I'm still rather confused and overwhelmed by the chaos in the Indian temples and the icons they have there of the different gods. It's very strange and bewildering to me as an outsider. It makes perfect sense to people in that culture, but for me as an outsider, it feels strange. And so religions often have conflicts on that level, on that external level, over the images of God, over the dogmas and doctrines, over the rituals, over the dress and vestments, and they look so different on that level. And that's why this Festival of Faith, focusing on silence, is so important, because what's remarkable is though religions differ on so many levels that are external, they all agree when it comes to the contemplative practices. They all agree that silence is the way to a reality that transcends yourself. And so the Festival of Faith rightly focuses not on where we are different or where we disagree, but it focuses on where all the religions concur that silence is the path to God.
Well, Father Joe, I look forward to continuing this conversation in a few weeks and hearing more. So thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan, very much for your interest and for having me on.